and reinforcements. We're going to advance. Reinforcements. We're going to advance. Centaurs. We're going to advance. Centaurs. We're going to advance.
Of course, Chinese whispers would be no fun if the final story wasn't completely different from the first one. The story changes partly because you can't hear it clearly, but also because you make sense of it as you remember what you've been told and pass it on. To these 8-year-olds, centaurs seem to make more sense than reinforcements. At the time of the First World War, the British psychologist Sir Frederic Bartlett was working at Cambridge University, and this game gave him the idea for an experiment using a story called The War of the Ghosts. What he found out about the way our memory works was startling, and at the time, revolutionary.
It doesn't work like a videotape recorder. We don't just record the event and play it back later. The process involves reconstruction, and our memories are changed by new information that we encounter after some event is completely over. And that's probably something that Bartlett understood very well some 60 or 70 years ago.
You know where your hand is, even though you're not looking at it, because you have, if you like, a schema, a model inside your head. Bartlett argued that, in fact, we had schemas of our assumptions about the world. So when something new comes up, we understand it and store it in terms of what's old.
So Frederic Bartlett started his career at St John's College in Cambridge, and this was the room he was in. I'm joined by Professor Bill Brewer from the University of Illinois.
Yes, he was a fellow at St John's College here, and in fact probably did some of the analysis of the famous War of the Ghosts story right here.
He's got some nice views, I noticed, overlooking the St John's quadrangle.
Yeah, this was the third quadrangle. And you can see, actually, look over here, you can see the famous St. John's Tower. And once a year, the St. John's choral group gets on top of that and sings.
Memory had only just started to be considered a psychological rather than a philosophical subject, but the research was nothing like Bartlett's. A German psychologist called Herman Ebbinghaus dominated the field. He spent days at a time learning lists of nonsense words, testing himself to see precisely how many he could remember. Bartlett's approach was radically different.
Bartlett says the famous American mathematician Norbert Wiener was here, and they were walking along the backs together that we can see out the window here, and Norbert Wiener told him about a party game that is used in the U.S. I never had a name for it, but my undergraduates tell me in the U.S. it's currently called telephone.
Centaur are going to be advanced. Centaur are going to be advanced.
Apparently Bartlett knew the game as Russian scandal, but it boiled down to the same thing, and it sparked an idea, a way of challenging the prevalent views on memory. Alan Badley, consulting professor of psychology at the University of York.
Bartlett felt that remembering strings of unrelated words didn't tell you too much about how your memory really works. So what he did was to use realistic materials like stories, drawings, and in particular he was interested in cultural differences. And so some of the materials he used were taken from other cultures.
As was the case with his most famous experiment, the War of the Ghosts. Bartlett did this study during the First World War, so we thought we'd see what happens today. I roped in 2 volunteers, Christine and Andrew, and had them listen to the exact same Native American story that Bartlett's subjects heard nearly a century earlier. I'm going to play you this story. It's not very long, and then afterwards I'm going to get you to tell me the story. Okay?
Okay.
One night, 2 young men from Egulac went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles, and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We're going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. "I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone." "But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." So one of the young men went, but the other returned home, and the warriors went on up the river to a town on the other side of Calamar. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home, that Indian's been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they're ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he'd been shot. So the canoes went back to Egulac, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, and then became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried. He was dead.
Did you enjoy that story?
Oh, there's a lot of detail there, wasn't there?
A lot of detail, yeah.
Yes.
Now, for 15 minutes, you can just do whatever you want, and then I'm going to ask you in 15 minutes' time, so don't
Okay.
discuss it.
I hardly remember anything already.
I found his actual notebook where the War of the Ghost stories were in, and it's fairly evident that what his methodology was that he would come up to somebody. So you can imagine the Cambridge undergrad on their bike in their robes, as they would have to be in there, and I guess maybe Bartlett would still be in his robes, walking down one of these medieval streets or passages, and he would stop the undergrad and say, "Come over here," have them read the War of the Ghosts. Then he would say, "Oh, now would you please write it down in this notebook?" And then he would wave the person goodbye. And then apparently the next time he saw them, some weeks or months later, he'd say, "Hey," and have them do a second, and then a third recall. And so the time intervals are just determined by when he found them, and the actual laboratory is sitting out in one of the Cambridge quads or streets.
Okay, time's up.
Well, as far as I can remember, there were two men, and they were sitting by the water, and they were seal hunting or something to do with seals.
Well, the first thing that Bartlett noticed was that there's a summarization process that people go through and leave out the irrelevant material. They tend to try to get the core essential structure, though in the case of the War of the Ghost, they're a little troubled by that because the plot isn't clear to a World War I Cambridge undergraduate, or apparently to the people that you got in 2003.
As he was telling the story, because he couldn't remember the other people being there, they suddenly disappeared. Or something happened, because it was very foggy. I remember there being something about fog, it being a foggy night.
They omit irrelevant information, and they omit unfamiliar things, and they omit inconsistent types of things. But there's a problem that even Bartlett noted, what he called curious preservation of the trivial. So occasionally people remember things that have no major importance for the story.
There were these two blokes, and they were in a place which sounded like a Scandinavian-type town.
The person hearing a slightly strange story, as the War of the Ghosts is, tends to change the odd things in the story to things that are more familiar in their own knowledge. Another kind of inference that people make, I call them pragmatic inferences. They're not logically required, but any kind of reasonable person with knowledge could see why the inference is made.
And apparently lots of people got killed or hurt in the fight, and then they came back in the boat, and suddenly all these five...
The original text, one of the ghosts says, "Let us go home." And your person recalls it as, they got back in the boat. Well, there's no discussion of getting back in the boat. But of course they got there by canoe. If they're going to go home, they're going to have to go by canoe. It makes perfect sense, but it's not what was in the text.
He felt pain and something came out of his mouth and he died. And that's about all I can remember.
There's a strange sentence toward the end that says something black came out of his mouth. And that had something to do with beliefs about ghosts and death in the Calumet Native American tribe. So it's very puzzling for a Western reader. And in one of Bartlett's protocols, he finds somebody who says he foamed at the mouth. One of his other people understood that the black coming out of the mouth was probably metaphorical and recalls it as the soul came out of his mouth.
So people are trying to make sense of it for themselves as it goes into their memory.
Bartlett had a phrase for that. People are doing what he called effort after meaning.
In order to explain this, he borrowed a term from neurology called a schema. The schema was a term invented to capture the way in which you know where parts of your body are. So you know where your hand is, even though you're not looking at it, because you have, if you like, a schema, a model inside your head. Bartlett argued that, in fact, we had schemas of our assumptions about the world, and that we used these in order to understand. So when something new comes up, we understand it and store it in terms of what's old. However, when things differ quite markedly, then it stretches and challenges the schema, and then you get interesting errors.
Today this might seem obvious, but when Bartlett published his findings in his 1932 book, Remembering, his schema idea didn't go down well. Professor Alan Badley.
When I was an undergraduate back in the 50s, I learnt about this in Britain, but it was criticised because the idea of a schema was too vague and too woolly. Ebbinghaus was long gone, but his tradition was very strong in North America. It was only in the 60s, with the development of cognitive psychology and the use of the computer metaphor, that it became clear that apparently woolly concepts like schemata actually could be instantiated, and also that memory was much more flexible and much richer than was captured by learning lists of unrelated words.
It's ironic that it was the arrival of precise, quantifiable computer technology that convinced skeptics that Bartlett was onto something with his imprecise, unquantifiable theory of memory. Bartlett's methods, though, did lack a certain rigour. In a slightly less random fashion than his flagging down of undergraduates on their bikes, I arranged to meet Andrew and Christine again 8 weeks and 12 weeks after they originally heard the War of the Ghost story, to check on just how much they remembered.
I don't remember a lot of the description, and I don't remember a lot of the names. But I do remember, I think, the gist of the story. There were two men sitting on a bank, and I think they might have been hunting for seals.
Now, in the second recall of Christine, she says, I do remember the phrase that there was blood coming from their mouth. Just wonderful. None of Bartlett's people happened to come up with blood coming out of the mouth, but your person did, and you can see it's exactly the same mental process as the person who did foam at the mouth.
That's amazing. People are still changing.
Well, the mind hasn't changed, basically, right? So it's really wonderful for me as an experimental psychologist to see this working so well. Magic. Not magic, science, maybe.
I first heard the story when I was a student, and all I could remember reading it 10 years later was that it was about men in boats and that there was something weird about it. So the atmosphere stayed with me, even though I couldn't remember any details. Of course, sometimes it's essential to remember things accurately, for instance with eyewitnesses in court. But if memory is as unreliable as we've heard, then can we trust their testimony?
She'd got scratches on her face. I said, and where's her glasses? She'd never without her glasses.
He was wearing a dark trench coat. There did appear to be some kind of camouflage clothing on him.
Worryingly, it seems to be easy for witnesses who are trying their best to get things right to be led astray. Elizabeth Loftus, Professor of Psychology at the University of California, Irvine, is a world authority on the subject.
One of the things that I have shown in my experiments is, first of all, memory is malleable. I showed this in experiments I conducted in the 70s and 80s where we would, for example, give people a simulated traffic accident or a simulated crime, and then we would deliberately try to manipulate their memory for certain details in the accident or crime. So we might make people think that a guy who was leaving the scene had curly hair instead of straight hair, or that the traffic sign at the intersection was a stop sign when it was actually some other sign. We would do this usually by asking leading questions or allowing people to overhear another witness who might describe something in an erroneous way. And we found that it was fairly easy to contaminate people's recollections, to get them to believe that they saw things that were different from the way they really were.
And do you think that we still place too much reliance in court, say, on eyewitness testimony?
We need to rely on eyewitness testimony, and some eyewitness testimony is quite reliable. And guilty people do get convicted of crimes, and rightly so. But because of new developments in DNA technology, we've been able to identify a number of people who spent long periods of time in prison for crimes they didn't do.
The problem is that in an eyewitness testimony situation, we're often stressing the memory, because on the whole, memory hasn't evolved to store the sort of detail that you might want from an eyewitness. Exactly what did he do? Was he holding this or holding that? These are things that on the whole we don't store in detail. Because they're legally important, then we try to probe and push beyond what can reliably be recalled. And that's when things are likely to be distorted by schemas. But of course, schemas are also very helpful. So if you consider a master chess player, the reason he can remember a position when just shown it briefly is that he's already got very rich schemas for chess positions.
Oh, so that information already is meaningful to him.
Yes,
It means something
yes.
important, whereas
Yeah.
if you just show it to me, it's just...
So schemas are absolutely useful, but they can mislead you.
In my current work, we're not just changing a detail here and there about an experience that someone really did have. We are planting entirely false memories into the minds of people, making people believe that they, for example, were lost for an extended period of time in a shopping mall, when in fact they weren't, making people believe that they witnessed demonic possession or they met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. We can get people to tell us and begin to remember these very detailed experiences that never happened.
And how do you do that?
Oh, we have a number of ways of doing it. I mean, one of my favorite ways is to tell our subjects that we have spoken to their mother or father and we have found out that certain things happened to them when they were children. And then we encourage them through suggestive interviewing to try to remember these made-up experiences.
And is it quite easy? And will it work with most people? Or?
We succeeded in about a quarter of our adult subjects in getting people to believe that they had this experience. But since we published that study, other investigators from around the world have gotten sometimes as many as 50% of their samples to remember these made-up experiences.
And does it only work if it's about memories when they were very little, where things are a bit sketchy anyway? Or could you persuade someone to remember something that happened 5 years ago if they were an adult?
We make people remember that they had experiences 2 weeks ago that they didn't have. That
Really?
Yes, for example, that they stuck a toothpick in some silly putty or that they kissed a plastic frog. Even though we know exactly what they did 2 weeks ago when they came into the laboratory, they didn't do those particular things. But through guided imagination, we can get people to believe that they did those things that we suggested to them.
If you can actually plant memories in a person's mind and have them truly believe that they happened, then this has implications for the theory of false memory. It's the highly controversial idea that some adults who remember being sexually abused as a child might be remembering things that never happened.
I mean, of course, there is a lot of genuine victims of that awful crime, but at the same time, there are also people who have generated in their minds years of, say, satanic ritual abuse or years and years of brutalization that they claim happened to them, and ultimately these cases, many of them have been proven to be false. And I think that the work that I and others have done can show how people can be led through suggestion and auto-suggestion to develop these kinds of false memories. So when you see them testifying in court, even when the memory turns out to be false, they're not deliberately lying.
Obviously, Bartlett's work didn't lead on to this. This arose as a kind of social problem, this idea that people were making claims about the past that in some cases it could be shown were highly unlikely to have happened.
James Ost, lecturer in psychology at the University of Portsmouth.
What researchers began to do was then quote this kind of mantra, memory is reconstructive and unreliable, and quote Bartlett. And actually, Bartlett's theory is far more subtle and nuanced than that. He's not making these kind of grand claims. What he's actually saying is a more important message that memory or remembering, you've got to look at it as a kind of social activity. Memory can vary dramatically depending on the context in which it occurs, and that's the kind of main take-home message from his work that I think sometimes gets missed, especially in this kind of false memory area where people say false memories can or cannot occur. Well, that's not the issue. The issue is under what circumstances are their claims likely to be more or less reliable. Say, comparing a police interview with someone remembering in, say, therapeutic context, okay? In the police context, there's a very definite kind of script there. It's not just about remembering what you've seen. It's about producing a coherent, logical, structured narrative about, X followed Y, then he did this, then that, and producing something that's going to stand up and look convincing in court. Compare that to the therapeutic context where it's not so much about what happened, but it's about trying to make sense to another person about what happened to you in your childhood. And I'd argue they're two completely different contexts. And what you claim to remember or how you report the past in those contexts actually will vary tremendously. And this is really the kind of point that I think, and not actually just me, but a lot of other people think that Bartlett was actually trying to make in his work.
Bartlett died in 1969, long before anyone was talking about false memory syndrome. But it's not the only area that his work still affects. The other is a bit more surprising: artificial intelligence.
1975, Marvin Minsky was trying to solve the problems of how to make computers perceive, understand language, get around in the world, and things like that. And he stumbles across Bartlett's book, and he has this epiphany. He says, look, we in the computer science area have been trying to make people, let's say, perceive a room like the one we're sitting in here by looking at the low-level things in the room and then working up from the little pieces of light and dark and trying to figure out that's a cabinet or that's a window over in there, that's a curtain. He realized that human beings in doing that are using their knowledge in addition to the stuff that's coming in. So you and I know we're sitting in a Cambridge room in which it's going to be reasonable to look out and see nice trees out the back and so forth. So if we went over to that window and we opened it up and the Sahara Desert was there, we would be blown away. And Minsky then realized that he was trying to do the task in computer science with one hand tied behind his back. So he said, well, gee, what we in computer science have to do is put the knowledge in the computer, so the computer then will have the advantage that the human being does.
So thanks to Bartlett, artificial intelligence was born. If he'd been around, Bartlett would have relished this, because he was particularly interested in the practical applications of psychology. He directed the Applied Psychology Unit at Cambridge and spent the war years working on projects like improving cockpit conditions for pilots. The unit soon became a centre of excellence that everyone in the field wanted to join. Professor Norman Mackworth arrived there in 1940 and became director in 1951 after Bartlett's retirement.
One visitor said that it was like visiting a library, because by going through the corridors you could meet some of the head men who previously had simply been a name in the book.
And is it right that in the 1940s that Bartlett more or less sort of was in control of academic psychology?
Yes, that's one reason why he was able to pick these remarkable people. He was in the fortunate position of having had all the heads of departments in his classes in Cambridge, and for a time he could call the shots as regards the choice of the people who worked for him.
I was a student there almost at the end of his career, and he then took me on, recognising my intrinsic amazing genius, of course, and he actually gave me a research room before I graduated, which was rather nice.
Professor Richard Gregory from Bristol University, who was to become one of the best known of Bartlett's students, writing more than 20 books on psychology.
He's sort of permeated my mind, really. He's my sort of intellectual grandfather, I suppose. He was avuncular. He was quite formidable. I mean, when he came into the room, you certainly sort of stood up, you know, and you took notice, and you made sure you weren't saying stupid things.
He liked discussions, but he would always hold back until the appropriate moment, and his timing was quite remarkable. He would use a number of things like lighting his pipe and sucking on it, and then he would produce the clincher, and that demolished a lot of people.
He certainly had strong opinions. He certainly had favourites, and I was extremely fortunate because I happened to be one of them. For some reason he took to me, and I used to go to his house, play tennis with his sons, and he gave me really rather special privileges. And one never knew why some people were picked but not others. But the people he liked got total support, and they could go off and do crazy things if they wanted to, and he'd go on supporting them. I think he's an extraordinarily wise, understanding, and delightful person.
Although most days he was totally accessible, a knock on the door during 3 days before Christmas, and he was not available because he was writing his annual Christmas story for his 2 children, and that meant utmost priority.
I built flight simulators for the moon landing and doing experiments for the American Air Force, and I had a sort of electric railway down the central corridor of my laboratory. I had the top floor of the building, and also a huge, great parallelogram swing. And Sir Frederic came in with 6 nuns. And I will never, ever forget this. They were young, rather pretty, as I remember it. And one of them sat on this swing, and we gave the others a ride on the railway. They became little girls, these nuns. It was the most amusing thing in the world. They sort of giggled, and Bartlett was sitting there with his avuncular smile, incredibly amused by this, and it was very, very, very funny.
One time he was doing a demonstration in the Royal Institution at London. He forgot an important equipment. He forgot to take it from Cambridge to London. Bartlett was the first to enjoy the headline, which was Britain's #1 memory man forgets gadget.
And psychologists don't often make the headlines even today. It seems this wasn't his only memory lapse, though. Even though Bartlett knew just how unreliable our memories can be, he wasn't immune to remembering things wrongly himself.
Bartlett says that his participants frequently shifted the word paddling to rowing. When I look at the original text, and it mentions the word paddle, it mentions canoe, it mentions they move up and down the river, but it happens to never say paddling. So he was a victim of his own memory processes, which we all are.
We certainly are, so perhaps in view of his achievements, we can let him off.
He had an immense breadth, plus a sort of overriding, or should I say underlying, philosophy of the mind as active, as seeking information and understanding, seeking to organise the data around us. I think that was his big point.
In one of the book reviews I found of his famous 1932 book, an American reviewer says something like, well, you might want to buy this book and put it on your shelf, but it's never going to become one of the major contributions to the field. When the world changes in the 70s, it now isn't some moldy idea from Cambridge University in World War I. It's a hot new thing from computer science.
Certainly the concept of a schema is still a very important and powerful one to explain behaviour, in the sense that he was the first person to propose that knowledge is held together in this way. I think he's always going to be important.
And to think it all started almost 100 years ago with a simple game of Chinese whispers. I wonder where the one that started at the beginning of the programme has got to now. Whether they're still having a good day in France. Or by now, will it be 7 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance.
Have a good day in France. Have a good day in France. Abracadabra. Abracadabra. Abracadabra.
Can you read that out?
Send reinforcements, we're going to advance.